On the evening of January 30, 1948, a 78-year-old man was walking to his daily prayer meeting in New Delhi. He was thin, dangerously thin, weakened by years of fasting, by decades of imprisonment, by the weight of a nation he had carried on his back for most of his adult life. He walked slowly, supported by two young women, one on each arm. A crowd had gathered, as they always did. People reached out to touch him as he passed. He stopped to greet them, pressing his hands together. And then a man stepped out of the crowd, raised a pistol, and fired. Mahatma Gandhi fell. His last words, by most accounts, were, "Hey Ram, oh God." He was dead within minutes. The man who had driven the British Empire out of India without firing a single bullet had been killed by one of his own countrymen. And the philosophy that had guided every decision of his extraordinary life, the ancient Indian concept of Dharma, is the reason that even in death, he did not lose. Dharma is one of the oldest and most complex ideas in human history. The word itself comes from the Sanskrit root, dry, meaning to hold, to sustain, to uphold. It has been translated as duty, righteousness, cosmic order, moral law, and the right way of living, and all of these translations are correct and none of them is complete. Dharma is not a single thing. It is the principle that holds the universe together. It is the law that governs not just human behavior but the behavior of everything, the sun rising, the seasons turning, water flowing downhill. Everything that exists has a dharma, a nature, a role in the order of things. And for human beings, the central question of dharma is this: what is your role? What is the specific duty that your life, your position, your moment in history requires of you? Not what you want. Not what is comfortable. Not what is safe. What does this moment demand? The Bhagavad Gita, one of the central texts of Hindu philosophy, opens with a man who cannot answer this question. Arjuna is a warrior, standing on a battlefield, about to fight a civil war against his own family. He looks across the field and sees his cousins, his teachers, his friends. He puts down his bow. He cannot do it. He tells his charioteer, who happens to be the god Krishna in disguise, that he would rather die than kill the people he loves. And Krishna's response to him is the heart of Dharma. He tells Arjuna, "Your feelings are understandable, but they are irrelevant. You are a warrior. This is a just war. Your duty is to fight. To refuse your dharma because it is painful is not compassion, it is cowardice dressed as virtue. The soul does not die. Only the body dies. Do your duty without attachment to the outcome. Act because it is right to act, not because you expect a reward." Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born on October 2, 1869, in the coastal town of Porbandar, in what is now the state of Gujarat in western India. His father was the chief minister of a small princely state. His mother was a deeply religious woman who practiced regular fasting and prayer, and whose quiet moral seriousness left a permanent mark on her son. Gandhi was not a remarkable child. He was shy, mediocre in school, terrified of the dark. He was married at 13, in an arranged marriage to a girl named Kasturba, and he described himself in those early years as a jealous, controlling, and often unkind husband. He was, by his own account, ordinary. And the story of how an ordinary, frightened, mediocre boy became the man who brought down an empire is, at its core, a story about finding your dharma and refusing to let go of it no matter what it costs. In 1888, at the age of 18, Gandhi sailed to England to study law. He had to cross the ocean against the wishes of his caste, which forbade such travel, and he was formally outcast for doing so. He arrived in London with no money, no connections, and no English beyond what he had learned in school. He was awkward, overdressed, unable to make conversation. He spent 3 years studying, passed his bar exams, and returned to India in 1891, only to discover that the legal profession in India was intensely competitive and that he had no talent whatsoever for courtroom argument. His first case was a disaster. He froze in front of the judge and sat down without saying a word. He could not speak in public. He could barely hold a conversation without his voice shaking. This was not a man who looked like he was destined to change the world. In 1893, a small opportunity arrived. An Indian merchant firm in South Africa needed a lawyer for a year-long contract. Gandhi took it. He had never been to South Africa. He did not know what was waiting for him there. What was waiting for him was his dharma, though he would not have used that word yet. On June 7, 1893, Gandhi boarded a train in Durban, South Africa, with a first-class ticket. He was well-dressed, professionally qualified, traveling on legitimate business. At Pietermaritzburg station, a white passenger complained about sharing a carriage with an Indian man, and a railway official ordered Gandhi to move to the third-class carriage at the back of the train. Gandhi refused. The police were called. He was thrown off the train. He sat alone on the platform in the freezing night, his luggage thrown off with him, trying to decide what to do. He could accept humiliation and get on the next train. He could return to India. Or he could do something about it. He spent the night thinking. And by morning, something had shifted. He later wrote that this night was the most formative of his life, not because of what was done to him, but because of the decision it forced him to make. He could see that what had been done to him was done every day to millions of people. He could see that it was systematic, deliberate, and violent in everything but its physical form. And he could see, with a clarity that surprised him, that this was the specific injustice he was placed here to fight. Not because he chose it. Because it chose him. This was his Dharma. He stayed in South Africa for 21 years. He had come for 1 year. The man who could not speak in public became one of the most powerful orators in the world. The man who had frozen in a courtroom became a legal strategist whose techniques were studied by resistance movements on every continent. He built communities, organized strikes, challenged laws, went to prison, went on hunger strikes, and developed, piece by piece, failure by failure, imprisonment by imprisonment, the philosophy of non-violent resistance that he called satyagraha. The word is Sanskrit. Satya means truth, agraha means holding firmly. Satyagraha is truth force. The insistence on truth as a weapon more powerful than any physical force. Not because violence cannot win battles, but because violence always loses the peace. Because an empire defeated by force can return. An empire defeated by its own conscience cannot. The philosophical foundation of satyagraha is Dharma. Gandhi believed that every human being has an obligation, not a choice, an obligation, to resist injustice. Not with hatred, because hatred makes you into the thing you are fighting. Not with violence, because violence gives your enemy a language they are more comfortable in than you are. But with the full force of your moral being, your willingness to suffer without retaliation, your absolute refusal to cooperate with what is wrong. The power of satyagraha comes from a paradox that takes time to understand. When you voluntarily accept suffering rather than either inflicting it or running from it, you expose the moral emptiness of the system inflicting that suffering. You force your oppressor to see himself. And that, Gandhi believed, was a force that no army could defeat. He returned to India in 1915. He was 45 years old. The Indian independence movement existed, but it was largely an elite phenomenon, educated lawyers and intellectuals writing petitions and giving speeches. Gandhi looked at this movement and saw immediately what was missing. The 300 million ordinary Indians, the farmers, the weavers, the untouchables, the women, had no voice in it. They were the ones most crushed by British rule, and they were the ones least represented in the fight against it. Gandhi's Dharma, as he understood it, was to change this. What followed over the next 30 years is one of the most remarkable campaigns in the history of human civilization. Gandhi did not just organize protests. He transformed the nature of resistance. He insisted on spinning his own cloth, a simple act, but one that directly challenged the British economic policy of destroying Indian textile production and forcing Indians to buy British cloth. He wore only a dhoti, the simple white cloth of ordinary Indian men, because he believed that a leader whose dharma was to speak for the poorest people in India had no right to dress differently from them. He walked. He fasted. He went to prison willingly, 11 times in total, for a combined period of more than 6 years, and each imprisonment strengthened rather than weakened the movement, because it demonstrated to the world the moral bankruptcy of an empire that imprisoned a man for making salt. The Salt March of 1930 is perhaps the single most perfect expression of Dharma as a political philosophy in recorded history. The British government held a monopoly on salt. Indians were forbidden from producing or collecting their own salt and required to buy it from the British at a taxed price. Salt was not a luxury. It was a biological necessity, consumed by every person in India regardless of caste, religion, or economic status. Gandhi announced that he would walk 240 miles to the sea, pick up a handful of salt from the beach, and by this simple act break the law. He was 71 years old. The British authorities initially dismissed this as theater. Journalists from around the world came to watch and expected to be disappointed. Gandhi walked for 24 days. Thousands of people joined the march as it passed through village after village. When he finally reached the sea at Dandi on April 6, 1930, bent down, and picked up a small lump of natural salt from the shore, the act was transmitted by newspaper and radio to the entire world. 60,000 people were arrested in the protests that followed. The British could not arrest their way out of it. You cannot imprison a conscience. You cannot make salt illegal and simultaneously convince the people you are ruling that your rule is legitimate. The Salt March did not end the British Empire immediately. But it broke something in the moral authority of that empire that never healed. Gandhi's Dharma required him to do things that people who admired him found incomprehensible, and things that people who opposed him found infuriating. He refused to support the Allied cause in the Second World War without a promise of Indian independence, a position that made him deeply unpopular in Britain and America, and that he maintained without apology. He fasted unto near death to stop communal violence between Hindus and Muslims, not once but many times, putting his own body between communities that wanted to kill each other. He walked into neighborhoods where riots were happening and simply stood there. When the British finally left India in 1947, the independence that Gandhi had spent his life working toward arrived soaked in blood. The partition of India and Pakistan produced one of the largest forced migrations in human history and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Gandhi grieved this more than any victory. He had spent 30 years insisting that Hindus and Muslims could share a nation, and in the moment of independence, they were turning on each other in the streets. He went to the worst affected areas alone. He fasted. He walked through refugee camps in his sandals, talking to people who had lost everything, insisting that the violence had to stop. People told him he was naive. People told him it was too late. People told him that his philosophy of nonviolence had failed. He told them, nonviolence had not failed. The people who claimed to follow it had not followed it far enough. Dharma does not promise that doing the right thing will produce the outcome you want. Dharma says, do the right thing regardless of the outcome. The Bhagavad Gita is very clear on this point. Act without attachment to the fruits of action. The duty is yours. The result belongs to the universe. This is the hardest part of Dharma to understand from the outside, and the part that makes Gandhi's life so difficult to absorb. He was not a saint. He was a human being with serious flaws. His treatment of his wife Kasturba was often controlling and cold. His views on race in his early South African years were troubling, and he later acknowledged this. His relationships with his sons were distant and damaging. He made political miscalculations. He held positions that his closest allies thought were wrong. But his commitment to his Dharma, to the specific duty that history had placed before him, never broke. Not in prison. Not in failure. Not in the grief of partition. Not in the face of the pistol on January 30, 1948. The man who fired at Gandhi was Nathuram Godse, a Hindu nationalist who believed that Gandhi's insistence on protecting Muslims during the partition had betrayed the Hindu nation. In other words, Gandhi was killed for refusing to abandon his Dharma in its most demanding moment, his insistence that every human being, regardless of religion, deserved to be protected. Godse was executed for the act. Gandhi's legacy became the foundation of nonviolent resistance movements on every continent: Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Aung San Suu Kyi, the Solidarity Movement in Poland, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. An empire that lasted 300 years was ended without a war by a man with no army, no weapons, and no political office, only a clarity about his duty that nothing could shake. Dharma does not ask whether you are ready. It does not ask whether the task is fair, or whether the odds are good, or whether you will be thanked. It asks only, what does this moment require of you? And then it waits for your answer. Gandhi's answer, given over and over across 80 years of life, was always the same. It is right. Therefore I will do it. That is Dharma. And it is, in the end, the only philosophy that has ever moved the world.